Let me start by names. The formation, which is known popularly as the Anders Army, started as the Wojsko Polskie w Związku Radzieckim, the Polish army in the Soviet Union. It was formed in Russia in the summer of 1941. 2 years later, it was the Wojsko Polskie na Bliskim Wschodzie, the Polish army in the Middle East. And then in the end of 1943, it became, or part of it became, the second corps of the British 8th Army, which was the British army fighting in the Italian campaign, which the second corps, the Polish second corps, was the biggest unit of the British 8th Army. There were more Polish soldiers than there were British soldiers in the 8th Army. And the commandant of this formation, General Władysław Anders, was at the head from the beginning right to the end. He was a Polish cavalry officer who was wounded in 1939. He was hospitalized, captured by the Soviets in Lvov, and then deported to Moscow. He was on death row in the Lubyanka, in the cells of the Lubyanka, expecting to be shot when they came and announced that he was going to be the commander of this new army. So the formation of the army took place in Russia on the Volga. The first camp was at Totskoye. And these were men and women. They were all Polish citizens. They were the survivors of some 2 million Polish citizens who were deported during the Nazi-Soviet pact from eastern Poland, that is from Lvov and Vilna and so on, to the Soviet Union, either to the Gulag, but more often simply administratively removed to Central Asia. For every person convicted by a Soviet court and sent to the Gulag, there were 4 or 5 other members of the family who were taken by the NKVD and just dumped in the wilds of Central Asia. Sorry, I hope you can hear me. In 1941, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Stalin was in desperate need of manpower. And he issued the only amnesty, I think, I know of, where all the people who'd been convicted and exiled in the previous couple of years were freed on condition they form an army to fight against the Germans. And thousands of people came from all parts of the Arctic and Central Asia to where the Polish army was formed on the Volga. The first aim, the original aim of the Polish army in the Soviet Union was to fight alongside the Red Army against the Germans on the Eastern Front. That was the original idea. But it never worked out for a variety of reasons. And we then get to the question of the evacuation from the Volga. But before that, I should mention something about the character of the army. The Anders army was made up of Polish citizens, but not of ethnic Poles only. Obviously, Poles were the largest group, but there were large numbers of Ukrainians. There was about 5,000 Jewish soldiers. There were Lithuanians. There was enough Lithuanians to form their own standard, to carry their Lithuanian flag. And this was the Polish army of the Second Republic, a multinational republic, unlike Poland today, which is mono-ethnic. It's pre-war Poland had many nationalities, and they were all qualified to serve in the Polish army. The other thing to say about it is that Anders was very neutral politically. He didn't make any discrimination against people whose politics he disliked. There were communists, Polish communists in the ranks. There were even Polish fascists. There was one ex-Polish prime minister who later defected to the Germans and died in Berlin. But he was in the Anders army to begin with. But Anders was very strict. No politics in the army. He didn't care what your background was, but if you tried to conduct politics in the army, you were in trouble. And some of the communists, for example, were locked up. And there was fierce discipline. So this Anders army is very different, as it were, from the Polish army of today, which is obviously a purely Polish army. Now, one or two pictures just to... This is me in Warsaw, and the monument to the deportations, 17th of September 1939, the day when the Soviet Union invaded Eastern Europe. These are the Gulag camps, the archipelago, hundreds of them, hundreds, all the way from the west to the Arctic, the Pacific Ocean. This is me in front of the Lubyanka, where Anders was imprisoned in the basement, the cells of that. This is Stalin signing the agreement with Sikorski in 1941. This is a military convention to begin with, which enabled the Polish army in the USA to be formed. This is Buzoluk, in just near the Volga, one of the places where the army began. These are places in Russia. This is a recent expedition to these places. This is the obelisk on the divide between Europe and Asia in the Urals, which, of course, the army crossed. And here we are back with Russia at the top, Central Asia here. The reasons why Anders didn't fight on the Eastern Front as originally designed are rather complicated. I think a major reason was that the Soviets wanted to split up the Polish army into units and disperse them among different Soviet formations, whereas the Poles, of course, wanted to fight together. And but there are lots of other reasons. the troops were not being fed on the Volga. It was, of course, freezing cold to begin with, and they migrated to Uzbekistan, where there's a new drama. In Uzbekistan, the troops who were weakened by a couple of years in the Gulag were very vulnerable to disease. There was an epidemic of cholera. There were more Polish soldiers died of cholera in Uzbekistan than died at Monte Cassino, to give you some idea. There then came the problem of what do you do with 80,000 Polish soldiers in Central Asia. Stalin realized that he was not going to be able to use them on the Eastern Front. And the Polish government in London got Winston Churchill to talk with Stalin, persuade them that these Polish soldiers could be used in Persia, in Iran. Persia was partly occupied by the Soviets and partly by the British. And the original aims of the German offensives in Russia were not to capture Moscow, they were to capture the oil fields. They were after Baku, the oil fields of northern Iraq, and the oil fields of Persia. And Churchill managed to persuade Stalin to release the Polish army, to send them to Persia with a view to defending the oil fields against the expected German attack. Here I should say one of Anders' key decisions. There were hundreds of thousands of Polish refugees in Central Asia who wanted to leave with him, and he couldn't possibly have taken them. But he decided to take two groups of people. One were families of soldiers, dependents of soldiers, and children. There were thousands, but thousands of Polish children without parents wandering around in Russia on the edges of the camps and so on. And Anders decided to take as many children as he could. And he took, I'm not quite certain, but between 10 and 20,000 children out of the Soviet Union, of course, saved their lives. Polish families in Yangiul was one of the main camps in Uzbekistan. You can see the soldiers are beginning to look like soldiers again. These were pictures from Iran. The army, to get to Persia, was ferried by ship across the Caspian Sea from Uzbekistan to Pahlavi in Persia. But here was another tragedy. There were thousands of Polish soldiers and civilians who died on the beach of Pahlavi because they were not used to eating. As soon as they arrived on the beach, there were fruit sellers selling fruit, and ice creams, and so on. And many of them gulped down the food and couldn't stand it. And there's a very tragic cemetery in Pahlavi, which has another name today, but there's a cemetery of children who simply died from exhaustion and from being fed for the first time. So we now get to Iran, Persia. The Polish army was taken in by the British authorities of Persia. They were fed, clothed, sheltered, and so on. But the big decision in Persia was what to do with the civilians. There were about 40,000 civilians, and to begin with, it wasn't clear what should happen. The Polish government in London put out an appeal to allied countries to take in civilians from Persia. And they received replies from Mexico. 5,000 Polish children were taken to Mexico from Persia. They sailed all around the world. 1,000 Polish children were taken to New Zealand. Many families, each of the British colonies of East Africa, Tanganyika, Uganda, and South Africa, of course, all took compliments. But the biggest cohort of people was taken by India. About 20,000 women, children, elderly people were taken by the Indian government and looked after for the rest of the war. A Polish lady who lived later on our street in Oxford spent what she said were the happiest years of her life in India. Her husband, of course, had to go off with the army. But many people remember that refuge in India as being the experience that saved their lives. The next stage will be Iraq. This is Tehran. It's November 1943. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. When Janusz Rosikon and I visited Tehran, the Russian ambassador, no longer the Soviet ambassador, the Russian ambassador said, "We still got the chairs from 1943. Do you want your picture taken in the chairs?" So here we are. I'm sitting in Churchill's chair. This is the Russian ambassador. Another little anecdote. The first thing the Russian ambassador said to us when we arrived, he said, "I'm not Russian." He was Armenian. And he served the best Armenian brandy I think we've ever tasted. Of course, Churchill liked Armenian brandy as well. So. The pictures have jumped. We were in Iran. After Iran, the army, the military people were taken to Iraq, neighboring Iraq, where originally they were supposed to be defending the oil fields, but of course the Germans never got to Iraq, so there was no fighting to be done. But the military forces were reorganized in the deserts of Iraq. There was a merger between the Anders army and the Carpathian Brigade. This was a Polish formation which had fought at Tobruk in North Africa. And after the North African campaign was sent to the Middle East, and they merged with the Polish army to form the Second Corps. But it was in Iraq that the troops were trained by the British. They, I've heard them talk of the day they were driven out into the desert, and there were rows of tanks waiting for them to learn to drive. There were thousands of vehicles. There was guns. There was intensive military training. And one of the nicest stories is that Anders made a decision that this huge army, which needed thousands of lorries, of ciężarówki, you know, that the women would be the driverki. They would be driving the lorries. And there are lots of stories, these little small women driving massive Leyland trucks. It was also a sensation when they got to Italy, because women were not allowed to drive in those days in Italy. And suddenly you have a whole army arriving, all driven by women. So Iraq is the place where the army is reformed, trained, and then sent on the next stage, which is Palestine. Palestine in 1943 was a British mandated territory. There was a civil war going on between the Jewish Zionists and the Arabs, and the Anders army arrived with around 5,000 Jewish soldiers, including, incidentally, Menachem Begin, who was a sergeant in the army. He became a prime minister of Israel. And some of the Polish Jewish soldiers started to desert. And Anders had a problem, what to do. And he telegraphed London, and the reply came back, let them go. And he gave them 2 weeks. If you're going to leave, you can leave with our blessing, but you've got to go now. And if you stay, you stay. And about 2,000 of them left, took their arms with them, and they were the biggest group that joined the Zionist underground, which became, in due course, the Israeli Defense Force. So these Polish Jewish soldiers, trained soldiers, became, if you like, the core element of the Israeli army. Over half of the Jewish soldiers stayed with Anders, and if you look at the cemetery in Monte Cassino, there are rows of Jewish graves and, of course, Ukrainian and Polish graves as well. So that was Palestine. The British didn't want the Polish army to stay in Palestine for obvious reasons. And that's where the decision was taken to send them all the way to Italy. The Italian campaign started in the summer of 1943 with the invasion of Sicily. And this was the time when the Anders army was in Palestine. So the British then prepared to take the Anders army, to ship them from, first of all, they had to go from Palestine to Egypt, and from Egypt, from the port of Alexandria, they were shipped to Taranto, where they began to arrive at the end of 1943. These are pictures, I think, of Israel. There's too much, unfortunately, to talk about. This is particularly interesting, the Lehi Museum in Tel Aviv. The Lehi was a branch of the Zionists which didn't suspend the Civil War during the Second World War, and they were fighting the British. And they were banned in Israel until this museum had only just been opened. Here we are in Taranto, so we should have a word or two about the Polish army in the second corps of the British army in Italy. The Poles were given the task of clearing the eastern coast of southern Italy of the Germans. The British and Americans were on the west coast, and the Poles went up the eastern coast from Taranto, Bari, all the way up to Loreto. And of course, the Poles were very popular with the Italians, especially the Italian women. Generally speaking, it's a happy story. Polish soldier in Matera. The fighting in Italy was particularly tough. The center of Italy is very mountainous. The advantage all the time was with the German defenders. They were sitting on the mountain tops, shooting at the advancing Allies, and it was a very slow and deadly campaign. Monte Cassino is something everybody hears about. What you don't always hear is the Battle of Monte Cassino lasted for 4 months. 4 months. And several Allied armies attempted to capture Monte Cassino. In turn, the New Zealanders, the French. The Poles were the last in May, and it was the Poles who succeeded in reaching the summit of the Abbey. It was an extraordinary feat. If you've ever been to Monte Cassino, it's just a huge mountain, extremely steep, where the defenders had all the advantages. Here's Anders at Monte Cassino. Actually, I was not too happy when the publishers insisted on putting this picture on the cover of the book. I felt that the real heroes, of course, I have great admiration for Anders, but the real heroes of the story are the men and women who covered the whole trail from Russia to the end. But this was, if you like, the crowning military moment of the whole trail. Here's the cemetery at Monte Cassino, where the ceremonies will be at the end of this week. This is me talking to a veteran about and my son. Lovely Italian weather, there you are. The fighting in Italy didn't stop at Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino was just one stop on the long road. Monte Cassino opened the way to Rome. Rome was taken shortly afterwards. A month later, the Italian fascist government had gone, but German resistance continued. The Germans formed a republic in the north of Italy, and the Poles had, and everybody else kept fighting until the spring of 1945. The Battle of Ancona, it's on the eastern coast. Bologna was the final stop, April 1945. Historically, I think you have to realize that the Italian campaign was not a huge success from the Allied point of view. From the German perspective, which few people think of, it was quite a success. The Germans prevented the Allies getting to the Alps. Churchill had spoken optimistically of crossing the Alps into Austria. They never got near that. What, of course, the Allied campaign in Italy did was to keep 20 or so German divisions in Italy who couldn't take part in the battles north of the Alps. But it's not, as it were, such a straightforward story as some people would like to think. These are pictures from Italy. When the war ended, the Anders army was in northern Italy, centered on Bologna. But it was more than a year before their future was decided. This meant that what had been 80,000, there's more than 100,000 of them. I'll explain that in a second. But it was a time when the war had ended, the fighting had ended, and there was a lot of fraternization between Poles and Italians. There were a lot of marriages. Of course, Polish Catholics, Italian Catholics had no problem to marriage, and there's a lot of friendly feeling. There's also a lot of education. The soldiers were sat down and given courses of all the things they'd missed during the war. These men had been 18 years old, conscripted to the Polish army in 1939. 7 years later, they'd had no education, no studies or anything. But a lot happened in Italy, and a lot remember that day, that period, as a period of learning and of course, admiring Italian civilization. Looking at the clock, just a couple of things about in Italy which are quite interesting. One is that the British noticed that the Polish army was claiming more and more rations. They started with about 50,000 men. By the end of 1944, there was nearly 100,000 of them. And where did these extra troops come from? The Wehrmacht. There were thousands of Poles from Silesia and Pomerania in particular who had conscripted into the German forces, sent to Italy to fight the Allies, and thousands of those, about 40,000 of them, crossed the lines to join Anders. So the Anders army was, despite its losses, was growing and growing and growing. Of course, the British were puzzled where who was eating all these rations. Another interesting fact was at the end of the war, when the Poles got to Rimini, they came in contact, believe it or not, with the Waffen-SS Galician, Ukrainians. This Ukrainian division, which had been raised by the Germans earlier, had retreated westward, and they'd gone from Austria to Italy, and they surrendered to the Anders army. Why? Because Stalin was demanding that all Ukrainians be sent to Soviet Union, where they were all shot. Anybody who was repatriated to the Soviet Union, who had fought on the German side, all of them were shot. So these Ukrainians in Italy were very happy to surrender to the Poles. The British wanted to hand them over to the Soviets. And Anders refused. He said, these men are Polish citizens. They came from Galicia, but places like Sanok, Krosno, and Anders absolutely refused to hand them over. He said that if there's going to be a court-martial, it will be a Polish court-martial. It won't be a Soviet court-martial. And in the end, the British gave up and they said, okay, we'll take these Ukrainians with the Poles to England. So when the Polish army went to England in 1946, they took the Ukrainian Galician division with them. Nobody talks about it, but the Ukrainian Centre in Holland Park in London was essentially the headquarters of these Ukrainian refugees. But that is, again, an illustration of multinational pre-war Poland. The end of the story. I've got 5 minutes. Even 10. The British had these more than 100,000 troops in Italy, and they recommended, in the words of the Foreign Minister, Ernie Bevin, that you return to your homes in Poland. The British didn't realize that the homes of most of these Polish soldiers were no longer in Poland. That most of them came from Lwów, from Galicia, from the old eastern Poland, which was now in the Soviet Union. So they had no homes to return to. And the only large group of people from the Anders army who came to Poland were these men from the Wehrmacht, because they came from Silesia and Pomerania. Their homes were in Poland. But for most of the others, they had no homes to return to. So they all went to England. They joined what was called the Polish Resettlement Corps. They're given 2 years in which to adopt and to decide whether to stay in Britain or what to do. And about half of them decided to emigrate to the British Empire, essentially. The biggest group went to Canada. The United States was not taking refugees at the time. So many thousands went to Canada. Another big group went to Australia. We had a period in Tasmania, the bottom of the world, nearly in Antarctica. And lo and behold, still there's a big group of Poles there from the Anders army. They were taken to Tasmania in 1947. Many thousands went to Argentina, and another big group to New Zealand. So that about 250,000 Poles who were present in Great Britain in 1946. At least half of them migrated elsewhere. The final touch, 1950. A famous ship called the Windrush, SS Windrush, sailed from Mexico to Jamaica. And in Jamaica, it took on the first group of Jamaicans who were sent to Britain to work to rebuild Britain. What the stories don't tell you is that on that ship, there were 500 Polish children. And these were the residue of the Polish children sent to Mexico. Most of the Polish children in Mexico were taken in by the Poles of Chicago. There's a charity organization which took them into America. So whatever, 4,000 or more went to Chicago, but 500 of them wanted to join their relatives in Britain. And that last shipload, 1950, sailed from Mexico to Jamaica, and they were on the same ship as the Jamaican workers who came to England. So there it is, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry to be racing along, but I made it by 7 o'clock. And thank you very much for your attention.